Eric, thank you so much. In the space of about 22 minutes, you covered almost all the issues that we hoped that someone would open the conference with. We got a huge array of issues that to digest. You talked about the need to make peace a precondition for how we live in the world. You talked about the need to look at what unites us rather than what divides us, and to move away from the sort of very simplistic ideas that we live in a world where democracy versus autocracy is the challenge of our times. And you also really brought into focus the need for the large powers to understand that they need to collaborate. And at times I thought you were half Chinese, half a bit of Norwegian, European, and a bit of Indian as well. So thank you for bringing all of that together. I think you set the stage perfectly for the next panel. I hope you'll stay on and indulge us with your presence, because whilst the first panel starts, and then we have a Q&A, I would, if you are around, like to invite you to make a few comments or answer any of the questions as well, if you have the time. But once again, let me thank you for the most inspiring discussion that brought so much together in a very short space of time. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so my apologies for the little technical hitch up for a minute there, but I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear now. So now we'll move into the first panel. I'm very delighted that we have an extremely distinguished and diverse group of people who will join us for the next session. And I hope all the panelists will turn their cameras on so we can all see them, and we can start the session. So panel one's session, the title of the panel is Stability and Shared Prosperity, the Elusive Global Challenge. Eric's outlined why we have no choice but to come together. In the world we live in, it looks awfully complex. At times, the narratives seem to even suggest it's hopeless. But Eric so rightly pointed out, it's actually much better than we think. But if we don't start to bring together discussions that allow policymakers around the world to see that issues like decoupling are actually counterproductive, we will not get very far with all these sort of advances we've made. So the first panel will talk about stability and shared prosperity and address the issue of why does it remain elusive? Or is it not really elusive, but actually slightly flawed, and how do we improve it? So I'll take just a couple of minutes without going into the full CVs of our distinguished panel members, because you can read them all, but to welcome them in alphabetical order. First, let me welcome Dr. Huiyao Wang, who is the president for the Center for China and Globalization, former vice chairman of the China Association, no, current vice chairman for the China Association for International Economic Cooperation, and a very distinguished academic. So Dr. Wang, thank you very much for joining us. Second, I'd like to welcome Jayant Menon, who's based in Singapore, a senior fellow at the Elusive Institute, the ICAS Elusive Institute, a former lead chief economist at the Asian Development Bank. Jayant, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Next, I'd like to welcome Professor Jomo Sundaram, fellow Malaysian. So Jomo, thank you for joining us. A former Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development at the UN, a distinguished academic, written a lot, been an advisor to various Malaysian governments, etc. Jomo, thank you for joining us. Next, I'd like to welcome Matthew Burrows. I don't know what time it is in Washington, Matthew, but thank you so much for joining us. This is the first time we've had someone from North America join us. Distinguished fellow at the Stimson Institute. He's worked for the State Department, so we are privileged to have someone who's worked for the United States government, former member of the National Security Council, and also, can I say it, formerly worked for the CIA as well. We get a bit troubled here when we mention the word CIA, but you know, Matthew, who used to be with the CIA and an extremely distinguished research fellow as well. Next, I'd like thank you, Matthew, for waking up at, is it 4 a.m. there?
It's 1:30 a.m. 1:36 a.m.
Thank you. Then I'd like to invite Ovigwe Euguegu, who is based, I believe, in Nigeria, who is a very distinguished policy analysis, runs an organization called Development Reimagined, and his expertise is in geopolitics, geoeconomics, and security. Thank you, Ovigwe, for joining us. And finally, I'd like to welcome Ms. Xiong Yutong, who is Deputy Secretary General of the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation, one of the leading NGOs in China and a great advocate for biodiversity and conservation in China. So welcome all panel members. What I'm going to do is ask each of the panel members to make a statement and lay out their position on this grand idea of, can we meet the global challenges through stability and shared prosperity? Dr. Wang, can I invite you first to make your remarks? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chandra. Yeah, thank you, and all the distinguished panelists and all the audience. And it's really a great honor to participate in this very timely and also very important seminar. And also, I appreciate that Eric just gave also a very good introductory remark. And so, what I think the theme of our day is investing in stability and prosperity, the new multilateralism for development. I think this is really very relevant. And of course, our particular section is the inclusive global challenges, stability and shared prosperity. So I'd like to make a few points. And first, I think now we are actually at a crossroad for the globalization, and also probably at a turning point for the pandemic, particularly for China. You know, now China is already starting open, and then you know, we are taking a new strategy of this COVID policy now, and I think you know, we expect that the post-pandemic era is actually, I think, embracing all of us, including China. So how can we really take this opportunity and strengthen the global system and the global prosperity is really important. We also seen that China has launched a very high-level diplomacy. We see President Xi just in the recent few months, he's been visiting you know, Central Asia, you know, ASEAN, G20, APEC, and now Arab Summit, and you know, all those high-level 40 bilateral heads of state meetings. That's really important to I think to take, you know, China into a more active dialogue mode with the world, and then that is very much needed. And I think we probably going to see more international leaders coming to China. And so currently we are already having the State Department official visiting China, and so I hope that we will see more exchanges, dialogue, people-to-people exchanges, and also revival of the business that is really needed for going forward to really revive the downward spiral of these geopolitical relations. And let's put a floor there, and let's put a stability there. So that's my number one point. You know, we're at a crossroad, we're at a turning point. That's really needed. Second, I'd like to briefly introduce for example, China also now geared up for the new era, because we just concluded the 20th Party Congress last month, and of course we see that you know, in a new government position now, we are launching a new path of Chinese modernization. So which is great. I think the new, which is by mid of this century, China going to build into a modernized society. But I think that the economy, you know, the path, China has a very unique model. For example, China has 60% private sector, contribute over 60% of GDP. And then we have another 20% SOE, probably does all the social fare, you know, all the public goods, infrastructure, you know, 5G, all those, you know, parachute 40,000 medical staff into Wuhan, and all those very, you know, public affair type of job, which is needed in China for the stability and prosperity. But also we have another 20% multinationals, foreign companies in China that generate 40 million employment. Just Foxconn alone employs 2 million in China, a subcontract for Apple. And then of course we have also those companies, foreign companies, generate about almost 50% of China import-export. So I think this Chinese style of mixed economy, that's really unique in the world, and that's really very, very healthy for the a great past China experiment for the future. And also, of course, we say that China also now more sticks to the common prosperity. I understand that because, for example, China just lifted 800 million people out of poverty, extreme poverty for the last 100 million 10 years ahead of a 2030 agenda of a #1 priority. I think, now they are working on the prosperity. What about 300 million migrant workers? What about we have created a 400 million middle class? What about 1 billion, not in the middle class? So we have to, work on that. Let's create another 400 million maybe in the next 10, 20 years so that we can avoid this extremism, nationalism, populism, or this polarized, unbalanced, divide of the society, so that we don't see a deglobalization sentiment really get strengthened in China. So I think this is good. This is really hope to contribute to the world. Another, in addition to the 800 million people out of poverty, let's contribute another 400 million middle class in the next two decades, possibly. My final point, to say that now we have, we hear from Eric just said, there's a decoupling, there's a geopolitical, so this is really not health. We are living in a common, planet, and we are all global villagers. We have to really work on. I mean, this decoupling, we hope that because it's probably easy to say and not easy to do it because all those companies selling chips to China China is the largest buyer. China spend more buying chips than China spend more buying petroleum. 70% of Chinese petroleum depends on import, but China even spend more money on the chips import than buying petroleums. So I think that's really not good for those companies if they want to come prosperity. So this is really against economic law, against competitive advantage, and all those the theory we've been in practice for a long time. So I would like to see more economic alliance formed. We already have the China is in the last decade. For example, this year next year actually would be the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. China also launched the AIB. China also joined the RCEP. China is applying to join CPTPP, DEPA, and China just also is working with African Forum on the development. China has signed a number of economic agreements with Arab countries. Let's do more economic alliance. Rather, we've been seeing nowadays, there's a lot of security alliance bumped up. We see NATO expanding, but we see also Five Eyes trying to recruit Korea into that. We see Quad established, and then we see AUKUS that revived the nuclear submarines. So this really worries quite a lot of people. So I think, I would like to see, BRI work with B3W, that President Biden proposed B3W, Build Back Better World. That's great. I mean, then we have this EU put the global gateway and G7 global infrastructure. So let's, why not we can work together on those economic mechanisms. I really like to see World Bank, AIB and ADB and AFDB and all those development works together. We're facing all those challenges of climate change, and those are really common threat. And the pandemic, of course, we have to work together. The infrastructure, I mean, the many countries are falling behind. China is now leading that. I think we can work together. So I want to conclude that there are so much things we have to work together. Outer space we could do together, and many more. And also global south, how we can really help global south to cope with all those challenges. So I think that China, EU, US, and other countries, and G20, we should add the African Union into G20. Let's all work together, and then let's really set aside the geopolitics. Let's do geoeconomics. Let's do economic alliance rather than military alliance or secure alliance. So I think the way of China is doing now is trying to do more economic alliance. I think this is the way to go, and I hope we can revive WTO. Let's strengthen the UN system. Let's get a digital agreement in place. Let's get climate change all pushed forward. Many things that I think we can do, and I'm really pleased that we're talking about those things. Let's really have a shared future together. Let's do all the multilateralism. Let multilateral prevail. Thank you very much.
Dr. Wang, thank you so much again for bringing so much together. I've already seen some comments from people saying, that some of the remarks you've made have people from outside China who don't understand all of these discussions, and that these conversations are so rich. I'd like to take you up later, but I'll leave it to the others, particularly your issue about let's have more economic alliances rather than security alliances. And I think a lot of people will be also interested in your understanding and explanation of what is common prosperity in the Chinese context, because some outside China see it as a frightening concept of some sort of socialist utopia or something like that. So I'd like to hear from you. That's a good way for me to segue into inviting Dr. Menon, who's an economist, I think, who could pick up on some of your pieces. But Dr. Menon, your views on the overall theme of this panel, and particularly drawing also on your experience working with institutions like the ADB. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Chandran, and thank you for having me here today. I think I would like to pick up on a number of things that Dr. Wang has just mentioned, because it relates to my expertise. I'm a trade economist by training. I think, the politics and the economics are more tied together than ever before, and growing. That relationship is growing, but I will not try and venture too far out of my comfort zone and talk about the geopolitics, but I'm sure others will pick that up. But I think I want to talk about multilateralism from an economic and trade point of view, and how we need to defend that in ensuring global prosperity. I think Eric mentioned in his keynote how we need peace for prosperity, and I think this is very true, but we also need prosperity for peace. So it goes both ways, and I think a lot of the achievements that we've already spoken of, the improvements in the human condition, in social outcomes, in reducing poverty, and improving livelihoods, have come through our embrace of an open rules-based trading system and engaging actively in it. It's not without its problems, and I think some of those problems have not been addressed, and this is why we're seeing the rise in anti-globalization sentiment, which, by the way, started long before the pandemic, but has found new fodder in the pandemic and has risen to new heights. And I think this is the biggest threat that we face going forward, this rise in anti-globalization sentiment that's manifesting in new forms of protectionism. And I want to try and hone in on some of those issues relating to the new protectionism, if I may, because I think it lies at the heart of the challenge we face in preserving all that we have built so far, the prosperity, and also the multilateral system. So I think what we are seeing now, there are a few interesting shifts that we need to keep an eye on and we need to address going forward. Firstly, I think we're seeing a shift from restricting outputs to inputs. And these are all the factors of production: capital, labor, and technology. With capital, we are seeing the increasing calls for reshoring and nearshoring, which is basically reversing FDI or restricting capital, reversing capital flows. We're also seeing, that a lot of the restrictions on labor mobility that were put in place in the name of the pandemic have been slow to come down, especially in relation to low and middle skilled workers. There's a lot of competition for high skilled workers, especially in this region right now, but low and middle skilled workers, the barriers that have been raised for health reasons have been slow to come down. And some countries are even questioning whether they need to return to pre-pandemic levels of migrant labor dependence. And then, of course, there's all issues relating to technology and data, which we can pick up a bit later. Secondly, I think we're seeing a shift from taxes to subsidies. And tied in with that is this shift from tariff to non-tariff barriers. Here, I think, in particular, the US-China competition is particularly important, where we have seen an escalation in tensions driven mainly by the US. Well, they started the trade war, and it's now, I think, been perpetuated by the Biden administration. And this is not good for the US, it's not good for China, or not good for the world. But we are seeing that escalation. We've seen how the US has tried to provide subsidies to have firms return home, and so have the Japanese. But the experience with Japan, at least, is that the Japanese affiliates in China took those subsidies, went home, waited a while, and then returned to China. So clearly they haven't worked. And in fact, they've caused quite a bit of disruption and distortion. And so trying to re-engineer a supply chain, which has a new form through subsidies, has been expensive and ineffective. And I think attempts to push China out of the supply chain, out of global supply chains, will not be very helpful to any of the countries involved. One has to wonder whether it'll even be effective. So far, we have seen that the restructuring of supply chains, the relocation, has mainly affected the labor-intensive segment of supply chains. But the key supply chain industries, electronics, machinery, and automobiles, the capital-intensive segments of those key industries have not shifted to any great extent, despite all the escalation in the trade war. This is not to say that it cannot happen. It hasn't happened yet.
Jayant, can I ask you to take another half a minute, because then we'll come
Yeah.
back to the discussion.
Sure. Let me just try and wrap this up then. Yeah. I think this escalation is what we need to be concerned about. And if it moves towards banning technologies and people movement and so on, then we might see very disruptive shifts. But the last point I want to make before I finish is that all of this is couched nowadays in terms of values rather than policies. And here we hear a lot about things like resilience and self-reliance, things that are difficult to argue with because they are values. But this is basically protectionism in new clothing, and we need to be concerned about how these new types of protectionist policies are presented. And I think, we can increase resilience without necessarily having to be self-reliant, and that's something that we should be wary of. The new labels that we place on the new types of protectionism. So let me stop there, Chandran, and I look forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very sorry to have interrupted you, but I thank you for your indulging me. I think the points you made about we need prosperity for peace is the one I'd like to pick up, and everyone else to sort of chip in there. And particularly this issue about values as well, rather than policies. And these values are important, but when they masquerade as essentially something for protectionism, then something to worry about. So thank you for bringing that. That's also a nice way to invite our third speaker, Professor Jomo Sundaram, to talk about his viewpoint on this whole question about the elusive global challenge and shared prosperity. Over to you, Jomo.
Thank you very much, Chandran, and thank you especially for being able to join this very distinguished panel. Allow me to make a few remarks, basically making the case for the urgency of non-alignment especially for the developing world, but I would like to argue that perhaps Europe should also seriously think about non-alignment in the emerging new Cold War. And the second argument, I think, which is very important, especially if we are going to address the challenges of sustainable development, is the whole question of peace. We do not have a strong peace movement in the world today. We do not have any country which is actually actively seeking to try to promote peace. We do not have multilateral institutions, as Eric Solheim reminded us, which is effectively working towards ensuring peace. And this is a very dangerous threat. It is, we see, for example, the tripling of German military spending. We have seen a significant increase in Japanese military spending. We have seen military spending increasing all over the place. Very little money, less money available for sustainability, less money available for development. Inequalities in the world continue to persist, if not grow in some areas. So we have a situation which is basically hugely problematic. If we think about the origins of the situation we are in right now, we are confronted with a number of very serious problems. I'm afraid Eric's proposal of, it's all very well for politicians to work for their own perceived national self-interest. I'm afraid that's not good enough, because we know, for example, that this led to imperialism. We know, for example, that this led to a whole range of aggressions, often presented as the basis for national aggression. We also know that in the post-Second World War period, there have been many interventions. And in fact, in the last 30 years since the end of the First Cold War, we have seen more aggression, interventions involving the US and NATO than in the earlier period. Before the end of the first Cold War. So I think we have a very difficult situation right now. Globalization is a double-edged sword. It's not as cracked up as it made to be, and I agree quite a bit with Jayant as to many of the forces which once worked for globalization are now working against globalization. Let us not forget that after the global financial crisis of 2008, the countries which first raised their tariff barriers and increased other forms of protectionism were the richest countries in the world, the OECD countries, and so on. So we have a situation where we have to get beyond the rhetoric which is being presented by nation states and often by corporate leaders, to begin to understand and recognize that we have a number of problems and we need to be judicious in terms of what needs to be done. I do not think that with multilateralism under serious threat, as it is right now, that we can simply try to replace it with a new multilateralism. I agree with Eric Solheim's commentary about the problems of that multilateralism, but to wish for a new multilateralism to emerge, we do not have a figure like FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was able to create the conditions for the multilateralism which has prevailed to this point. We do not have FDR's view of that multilateralism was not just to create the United Nations in 1945, but also to create the economic conditions in 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, to create the conditions for reconstruction, for post-war reconstruction and development, as embodied in the World Bank's name. We know that since 1971, when President Nixon withdrew from the Bretton Woods system, we have basically lived in a non-system of the international monetary system, which is a non-system, which has been sustained by confidence and various number of other things, but which is always very precarious. So the world is held hostage precisely because of the threats to multilateralism. But does it mean that we treat for multilateralism? We have seen, for example, how in the OECD has taken it upon itself to impose, to introduce and impose corporate income taxation for the whole world. That is a task which is in the UN Charter, which will be left to the UN, and where the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is another institution which was created as part of the UN system, should be the implementing body. We do not have that. So let us save and revive the institutions of multilateralism as they were created in the mid-1940s at a very different time. Now we have a very different world since the end of the First Cold War. We have a period of what some people call sovereigntism in the US, as suggested by the Foreign Affairs Journal, or in other parts of the world, it's often referred to as a unipolar period. But that has basically come to an end. That basically came to an end around 2007, 2008, when Russia was expelled from the G8, and now we have this G7. And then at Bucharest, basically NATO announced its intention to expand. And we have a series of problems which need to be resolved. Now, I'm not suggesting that any developing country is able to resolve these problems, but it's interesting that the only country which is able to talk to both sides in this conflict has been Turkey, a country which is part of Eurasia, if you will, which is which in some ways is considered an international pariah, but nonetheless has played a very crucial and important role in maintaining, in being able to speak to all sides. So we need those kinds of institutions, and rather than turn to a new multilateralism, we try to rebuild a new multilateralism. Each of us, I'm sure, has a view of what it should be, but let's try to fix the existing one first before we discard it. And I think we've heard from Dr. Wang Huiyao and Dr. Menon about how important it is that peace is, and for sustainable development, and this is a precondition. But what can the developing world do? And I do not pretend to speak for any governments, but certainly I think that there is a great deal of sentiment in the developing world, and the developing world wants to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, what is sometimes called Agenda 2030, but it needs the international community to work in a supportive and complementary fashion. We have right now precisely the opposite. We have the breakdown of those elements of globalization which are positive. We have the increasing inequality, as we have seen. We have a refusal, for example, on the part of Europe. President Biden and other US officials were initially willing to not to demand, willing to suspend patent rights as far as the US, the anti-COVID-19 vaccines were concerned. But what we saw, the compromise which came out of the WTO ministerial meeting was a very, very poor compromise. It was but it was basically demanded by Europe. And we have the European High Commissioner right now who takes a view of the developing world as bordering, wanting to invade the garden of Europe. This is Mr. Borrell's view. So we need to seriously think about our choices. And I think we've heard from Eric Solheim. I think he was absolutely correct that what developing countries want is to be able to cooperate with China, to have investments from China, but also the US and others. The developing world has no interest in aligning itself in this Cold War. A Cold War which is, the last Cold War was supposedly ideological. This Cold War is not even ideological. We are talking about different systems of capitalism, different modes of capitalism, if you will. So I think it is very important for us to begin to think about how we create the conditions for peace, for international cooperation, and this really needs an activist multilateralism, where the developing world needs to be non-aligned and actively pacifist in the context of international tensions. Thank you very much.
Jomo, thank you. I'd like to take up on the theme of active pacifism from the developing world, and what would that look like? How would that, as regional policies, as a bloc, look like? But thank you very much. So with that, I'd like to move on to Dr. Matthew Burrows. And it's good to, we've had 3 speakers from Asia speak, and now we'll get someone from the United States who is extremely experienced, worked for various administrations and presidents, and who has a very interesting view about how collaboration should be, and that's why he's up at 2 a.m. talking to us. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you, Chandran. And I thank you for inviting me. I hate to be the kind of spoiler at this meeting. I agree with practically everything that has been said. And I am myself a critic of how the US, generally how the West has been conducting itself, I would say, starting with the pandemic, towards the developing world. I recently published a paper on "Is the West Losing the Global South?" which was kind of a plea for actually getting some attention on the sentiment in the global South. And repairing some of the I would say, fragmentation. I do think that we're in a world, and this has been described very well by the other speakers, which is not easily repaired. Starting with the US, if you were trying to move the US to a position of trying to develop peace talks with China, I think that's going to be a very hard undertaking. The anti-China feeling is one of the few issues in which are bipartisan in the US. And equally, although, there are a lot of people that are critical of this democracy versus authoritarianism framework, but nevertheless, that's very popular with policymakers, both in government and also ones from the other party outside of government. I would say that I particularly share the views of Dr. Menon what is happening on the economic side, because I think, and this goes back to 2008 in the US, of basically the end of any big regional trade regimes. I mean, after President Obama, who tried to get the Trans-Pacific Partnership ratified by the Senate, that was, of course, Trump and also Hillary Clinton basically repudiated that effort. And since then, you really have, other than the renewal of NAFTA, you've had no actual effort to increase market access, including with countries that the U.S. is, says it really wants to support, such as Taiwan. And now in the recent economic talks, market access of U.S. market really has been off the table. So that is, I think Europe has been much better. Under Trump, it expanded the number of trade agreements it had with the rest of the world. But the U.S. stands out and this is a particularly concerning because, as some speakers have brought up, with the increased under Trump, first the tariffs on Chinese goods, and now with the effort to strangle the development of very sophisticated chip technology in China, you're getting into really an area where protectionist not only has very serious economic implications, but is also further ramping up the geopolitical competition. So, I would love to say that all this can be easily unwound. I don't see, even with an international peace movement, that you can, and there's very little evidence of that in the US or even in other Western countries. You can see that's going to be redone, and there's going to be light, shining light to show the error of our ways. I don't see that happening, and I don't see that happening in the next 5-10 years. I do believe, on decoupling, that because of the cost to the US, the full decoupling will not happen unless there is, and this we want to really try to, prevent a US-China war. And then I think that would be catastrophic, not only for US and China, but for the rest of the world. Are there areas really of optimism? And I would point to several. One of them is the Global South itself. It basically has shown its power in the recent COP27 meeting, where loss and damage is now on the agenda, and the US had to accept it. And that was a very deaf campaign that Global South leaders waged. And I think and hats off to them for getting that first on the agenda and then put into the statement. Now, obviously, Western countries who don't have a very good track record on climate financing have to step up to the plate and actually put their wallet, as we say, where their mouth is. But nevertheless, I think that is real progress. And I do think climate is one of the areas in which you can see increasing progress by the global South to get its message across and to get Western countries to really take seriously what is happening to a lot of the developing world, all the damage that we're seeing, and try to help in a substantial way. Equally, the global South leaders were very good at moving, with all the criticism of the World Bank and the lack of climate financing, that they were actually able to move the needle to the point that I think the World Bank will begin to increase its climate financing and pay more attention to this issue. So first, I think, the new, if there is going to be new multilateralism or multilateralism, the old institutions, I think one of the big factors that will make it work more for the developing world is the developing world itself through the voices, the global South voices that we've heard. Second thing is the private sector. Now, this is, this was non-state actors or a phenomenon that occurred, actually way after when these institutions were founded, which was a very state-dominated world. And now we're in a world in which, private actors actually are making a huge difference. So whether you like him or not, but Elon Musk is providing internet connectivity to Ukraine. That can be expanded. I mean, he's operating to in Africa. I mean, that, hopefully you can get more government backing for that, but getting the private sector out there thinking about how technologies are going to help not rich countries, but the developing world. And what we've seen so far with that is a big, a big area of, at least for me, is a big area of optimism.
Matthew, I'm going to ask you, sorry to interrupt, to just wrap this up in 30 seconds, if you don't mind, then I can come back.
Okay. And so the basic message is here, yes, we should be pressing on major states and particularly US and China both, to find areas of cooperation and convergence. But I think we also have to be realistic that is not going to happen very fast. What we do need when we're thinking about this is ways that the developing world itself can move the needle on getting more assistance, putting pressure on Western richer countries, and think about private sector, the technologies out there, which, Starlink, can make huge things happen in the developing world now with ensuring and widening the internet access. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry again to have interrupted, but there's a lot there. I don't think you were sort of, disrupting the party. I think what you were doing is exactly what we wanted to hear, which is to hear a view which, we often hear someone from North America actually saying that the chances of getting the United States to talk to China, the sentiment is one that doesn't allow that. And that's very important for people from other parts of the world to also understand. But I think this sorts of conversations need to take place a lot more. I'm also very interested in your sort of point about how the developing countries should essentially, gather together on some of these issues. And that comes in the whole self-reliance, non-self-reliance, international cooperation. That makes it perfect now to move on to our fifth speaker, and I'm going to invite Ovigwe to give us his remarks, how he sees it, both, I think, from an African point of view and as a experienced policy analyst. Ovigwe, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me and giving the opportunity to speak to this conversation and joining such a distinguished collection of individuals. I think from the way I look at it, there is of course a case for strengthening multilateralism. There's a case for including collaboration and cooperation among the great powers, because we understand that is pivotal if multilateralism is really going to move forward. Whether you want to create a new level kind of multilateralism or you're just going to be the status quo improved, right? But from my perspective, we are not going to move forward if the issue that is causing the fracture of multilateralism, or at least the relationship between the major powers, is addressed. Because at the root cause of many of the challenges the world faces today, political and economic, is because of that relationship. And with COVID, we saw what that could do, with providing global public goods, addressing things like development debt and development finance, vaccines, and all of that. And if that relationship between China and the United States in particular doesn't improve, there's very little hope that we're going to see the kind of efforts at the global level that is needed to address the issues. And for the way I look at it is, what is really at the root cause? There are very, very many perspectives to it, from both structural realist perspective or even its political economic perspective. I tend to agree more with the structural realist perspective because, of course, we know there's an insistence of US preponderance and also a preference for the liberal international order being as international as possible, as global as possible. And this is not even just what I'm saying, it is in the US policy documents, whether it's a US global strategy, strategy that was developed during the Trump administration, or even US strategy for Africa. Everywhere you see that there's an insistence on US preponderance. And it begs the question, why that insistence, and what is the consequence of that insistence? And the consequence of that is, whenever, of course, there is a country that is seen as a threat to that preponderance, there's going to be a competition, and that is what we're seeing today. And the competition doesn't really save the world. It doesn't allow the world to solve problems that the world is supposed to solve. When there was a time when the US was the only game in town, it seemed multilateralism worked more because there was no alternative perspective. There was no alternative view. But today, of course, it's not the case. And even the challenges to the liberal international order that was established by the US in post-Cold War period, and even the unipolar moment that the US had following the end of the Cold War, those solutions worked in many ways in opening global economy, integrating for the global economy. But there were challenges to it as well that we just cannot deny. The insistence to spread liberal democracy all over the world was problematic in many ways. You just have to look at the Middle East, for instance. So now, if we cannot, like I said, if we cannot really sit down to say, of course, yes, we understand what the merits and what the proceeds or the benefits of liberal international order is, but today, considering the global economic political structure, we cannot move forward with this perspective, because again, even the economic part of it was very successful. But I'm sure everyone here would agree that globalization itself has created several problems and the globalization and the kind of economic structure that came in the labor international order has its own challenges. And its inability to solve global problems was exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we cannot say what we had before was perfect. So any argument that says, okay, we have to revitalize status quo, I think also still misses the fact that there were some challenges that needs to be addressed with regards to what we had before. And then addressing particularly the economic dimension of it, I think is very, very crucial, because just like a previous speaker mentioned, why do we have the kind of well, let's say animosity or this very hawkish stance towards China, even within the United States? Let's put aside the foreign policy elites and look at people within the United States. You will find that many a time Trump's message of China ate our lunch really flew with Americans, because they saw in real time how the industrial belt, quote unquote, was eroded. So even the most successful of countries have had to deal with the downsides of globalization.
Ovigwe, you're breaking up. Yeah, you're breaking up, but I hope
to reach, get better from Western think tanks and that the system is, it's as good as it is. So I will just wrap up to say, from the way I look at things, we have to really see the importance of addressing great power competition as the basis to create the kind of strategic stability that is needed for every single global solution, to be possible.
Thank you, Ovigwe. I think the big takeaway there for me was your point that unless we solve the U.S.-China relationship, the rest of the world will essentially suffer from the sort of turbulence created by that. And the U.S. preponderance issue has not been essentially tackled either. That's sort of interesting to hear from the African continent as well. Last but by no way least, I'd like to invite Xiong Yutong, who represents a very well-known and reputable NGO in China dealing with conservation biodiversity. Yutong, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yutong Xiong from CBC GDF. So, what I'm going to talk today. I'm very happy to be here today for this important discussion. And what I'm going to talk today will be mostly based on my area of that's environmental and ecological protection work. And about today's topic, how to enhance multilateralism and to tackle problems facing mankind. My central point is that our civilization is facing the problem. My central view is that our civilization is at a juncture, is another critical moment in human history. The capitalist industrial model that has been developing for hundreds of years. Now it's time we move on with some new civilization thinking. The thinking based on ecological advanced society. And while there are multiple realistic level courses for today's geopolitical tension worldwide, I think maybe we should look a little back into the history to examine the root cause of the tension and the conflicts arising from the capitalist industrial civilization. We can see that in hundreds of years of industrial civilization, inequity has been rising between nations and regions. To a large extent, the imbalance we see nowadays is the result of a capitalist expansion over the past hundreds of years. I'm a photographer. I have been to Peru, Bolivia, Chile and Argentina in Latin America. Latin America is a very rich continent with a long cultural heritage and abundant natural resources. But as a naturally gifted land on Earth, Latin America is still one of the poorest regions in the world. In the 300 years after the Spanish colonist Francisco Pizarro entered Cusco, the then capital of the powerful Inca Empire, Spain, followed by Britain and the United States, has been depriving Latin America's natural resources and stifling Latin America's own industrial process. So in a small town, I've been to the eastern side of Bolivia. There is a mine belt with gold, silver, and other minerals. It's a town. There's a town called Potosi. Potosi was once world famous with the richest silver deposits. It was so prosperous in 1650 that it's one of the richest, one of the largest and the richest city on Earth. Its population was the same as London at that time, and larger than Paris and Rome or Madrid. But now Potosi is the poorest city in the poorest country in the world. The scene is really devastating, and I wish I could show some picture here. And Britain, later the US, followed the same line, only used Latin America as the source of a natural resource and the market for their industrial products. There used to be a very strict law to prohibit industrial production in Latin America. Nothing can be produced in the colonies, not even a pin. So there are many, many examples of unfair trade or the natural resource exploitation from Latin America. It's from guano trade from Pacific coast of Peru, niter from Bolivia, tin from Argentina, iron in Brazil, oil in Venezuela and Argentina, and of course, silver and gold in Peru and Bolivia. In hundreds of years, the Latin America never got a chance to step on the path of developing its own economy. So nowadays, the North-South imbalance is still one of the major sources of tensions. And everything we see nowadays actually has a reflection in history. Therefore, I think the capitalist industrial model is needed to monopolize a need for micro quantity of resource to keep the value-adding process, wealth procession through controlling the markets, the consumption-driven economic model. These are the basic rules for today's conflicts and tensions. And actually, the consumption-driven Western economic model is not reliable and outdated. The economic model that encourages excessive consumption focuses on the boom of the stock market and ignores water scarcity and food safety and ecological deterioration is unsustainable. And I agree with Chandran that the issues of environment, where our human beings lived, they are far more important than arguing about ideological conflicts. I would like to give a few more examples from the perspective of environmental and biological emergencies in nowadays world. Like in Paris Agreement.
Can I ask you to do it in like a minute and a half, please?
Okay, great, Chandran. So I will do that. So actually, for instance, in the Paris Agreement, the goals of NDECs, the national determined contributions from the countries, the NDECs altogether calculated will not reverse the rising of the temperature. Another example lies with the UN MDGs and also with the Aichi targets. Those are examples to reverse, to tackle the emergencies, to tackle the crisis facing our mankind nowadays. But so far, we don't see very satisfactory results, achievement. And also it's CBD, the Convention on Biological Convention, CBD, COP15 is right now being held in Montreal, Canada. And on CBD, we have failed twice the goals of CBD in 2010 and 2020. Now is a crucial moment whether we can achieve the third set of goals in biological diversity by 2030. The post-2020 biological framework, the GBF, actually is being negotiated is under negotiation right now. So the most talked about and the most controversial target of a GBF is to promise to protect by 2030 at least 30% of the land and water on Earth. But with a different states of development and different needs, that's challenging for some countries. For instance, many African countries may worry about protecting 30% of their land. Maybe it's too much when they are trying to develop. And also funding also remains a challenge, like because even monitoring biodiversity well and storing the data is expensive and it requires resources. The same funding problem still also lies with the achieving the goals in Paris Agreement. Actually, the developed countries, they have a promise to collectively mobilizing $100 billion from 2020 through 2030 to help the developing countries to fulfill their goals. But actually, we can see that the goals is not the mobilizing of a funding is still has a very big problems. And also, it's important.
Final point, please.
Final point.
Sorry.
We need to overcome ideological divisions, historical inequities, and a deep interest among countries to deal with the long-term emergencies. Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'd like to get the discussion a bit going now. And we've had 6 extremely insightful sort of position statements. What I'd like to do now is, I'd like the audience to please send questions forward so that I can pose it to the panel. So to the audience, we got a couple of questions coming in. I'd like to start off by actually talking about, what Yutong just said about a new civilizational order, and not as some philosophical basis, but tying together everything that's been said so far. So I'd like to start by asking Dr. Wang that you mentioned the Chinese idea about the common prosperity. And can I beg you all to keep your answers short so that we can go around the panel and get that. How do you tie that in, Dr. Wang, with what Yutong talked about, that the sort of basis of the industrial model, which is essentially not reliable, consumption-driven, and very much dependent on monopolistic control of resources. How does the Chinese view on that? And then Jan, I'd like you as a trade economist to jump into that one as well. So Dr. Wang, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this great question. I think that I think China probably is not interested in exporting model, but I think that China probably could share some of its experience of what and experiment as well. And basically, what I can see, there's quite a few things China is doing probably right. Is probably have some impact for developing countries. First is infrastructure. I think China has huge importance to the infrastructure. There's a saying in China: if you want to be rich, build road first. So I think that is really a great experience that China has. Second is really open door and attract foreign investment. As I said, China is a hybrid economy. The foreign companies accounts about 40–50% of China import-export and employs 50 million people. That's enormous. So that's a way, I think, for developing countries to adopt this open economy approach. Thirdly, is that trying to avoid this polarized between rich and the poor, where in some countries, 1% of elite and equals to almost 40–50% of a mass population wealth. And China is trying to, after leaving 800 million people out of poverty, they're trying to do another 300 million migrant workers in the city. Urbanization and education, compulsory education, you want to, Nair, as Eric mentioned already. So I think President Xi said, well, China has already built the largest education system, largest social security system, 1.3 billion, and the largest, Medicare system. So even though it's very primitive, but still. So I think those are the things probably a developing country can really emphasize: education, infrastructure, common, common prosperity, and of course also this, trying to avoid the paralyze of this Gini index and things like that. China is not perfect, but China is still trying to do. So those are things China should continue to do. And this hybrid economy, which is very unique, I think the Chinese path of modernization should be also another experiment China has.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Jayant, could you quickly respond to this sort of thesis that the industrial model, the model that we, the Washington Consensus model, etc., cannot be sustained because it's created such inequalities, and in a resource-constrained planet, the consumption issues that Yutong mentioned, etc. How does one address that within the sort of, the existing ideas, and how do the multilateral agencies, multilateralism work if they recognize that?
Okay, well, there's some very difficult questions that you want me to answer.
2 minutes, yeah.
Okay, all right. So when I was at the ADB, there was a lot of discussion about trying to promote inclusive growth. Today, it's a lot more about sustainable growth, and I guess we need to bring those together. And for inclusive growth, I guess it's all about not just creating equal opportunities, and that's the leveling of the playing field, but also creating the ability for people to access those opportunities on that level playing field. So it's not enough to say we remove the structural barriers and all the other policy restrictions and social, racial, all kinds of non-economic restrictions as well, but also unless you can actually equip people with the skills and the abilities or capabilities, if you want to use Amartya Sen's sort of terminology, then having access to those opportunities equally is meaningless. But I think the point here very quickly is that, the system has its failings. We've heard about the very sharp rises in inequality, and I think that is true, but it's not a reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think the system we have can be modified to work a lot better. There are vested interests that we need to overcome, and that's where the challenge lies. That's where the politics cuts into the economics, and getting the right policies in place when you're requiring these people to give up what they already have and don't need to give up is quite difficult. But I think there are changes happening. I think in China's successes has come from embracing globalization, and they've been a clear beneficiary. They have to play a bigger role now in guarding the global commons. When you're small and not so significant, you can free ride, but you can't anymore. But it has to also happen in a way that is acceptable to all parties, rather than sort of one country pointing the finger all the time. There has to be, I think, a lot more engagement constructively. But I think the system doesn't need an overhaul, but it needs to be tweaked. It's not easy, but we need to sort of deal with the negative unintended consequences, especially inequality, and now, the existential challenge, which is climate change.
Thank you, John. Very good. Eric, there's a question for you, if you don't mind me bringing you into the panel so for a minute. There's a question that said, and I think this is an important one, that hopefully you can give a quick response, but the question is, do you consider China to be not meddling in overseas politics if it practices debt trap diplomacy in order to cede strategic leverage? The question that China is creating debt traps in all of these countries, and particularly through the BRI initiative, etc. Perhaps you could help clarify that sort of thought that many people have.
I tend to believe that the idea of a debt trap diplomacy is propaganda coming from Washington. I'm very sorry to say, because nearly all developing nations have much more debt to the West than they have to China. As I said, just across the strait here is Sri Lanka, and that chat has been very much focused on Sri Lanka. Well, about 15% of Sri Lanka's debt is to China. The vast majority of Sri Lanka's debt is to Western-dominated institutions. When Sri Lanka is now embarking upon a way out of the financial crisis, they need to make an agreement with the International Monetary Fund on behalf of the Western-dominated institutions, and a parallel agreement with China, and a parallel agreement with India, because India and China is not involved in the IMF, they are separate. So in the case of Sri Lanka, it's a parallel with the West, China and India, but where most of the debt is to Western institutions. And if you look to Africa, African nations have a lot more debt to the West than to China. This is not to say that this is not a real issue. For sure, it's a real issue. But we need to be balanced in when and not start finger pointing to China when most of the debt is with the West. If you allow me one answer to the former question, I think the answer to that lies right here in Tamil Nadu, where I'm now. The day before yesterday, I was with the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, and we launched together the climate mission for Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is 80 million, the size of Germany, so this matters. And it was nothing about the problems of climate change. It was all about the enormous opportunities for Tamil Nadu to harness any number of jobs, being the wind industry power of India and the world, being a solar power, being a green hydrogen power, and also doing hydropower. So getting all the jobs without destroying nature. And it was about how to protect the fantastic beauty of this state of India, all the wetlands and national parks, to get more tourists into the state and to harness carbon credit from abroad. So, and this, I believe, is the attitude now of the two dominant developing nations, both China and India, and that is to look into not all the problems of environment destruction, but all the opportunities, getting jobs and prosperity by solving this. And for the first time in human history, this is possible because solar energy everywhere in the world is now much cheaper than coal. So there is no need to do it the old ways, which Yutong so powerfully described.
Thank you, Eric. Everyone, hang on, I've got lots of questions coming through. Ovigwe, I've got a question for you. We hear and read so much about China's involvement and investment in Africa, which in the Anglo-Saxon media, at least, is presented in a very negative light. What is the view from the ground on this topic? Is China making more enemies or friends in its approach in China? And do you think it's a viable model for collaboration in other developing regions like Latin America? So a quick response, because this is the question everyone hears a lot, issue everyone hears a lot about. Love to hear what you think from the ground up.
Yeah, so when you look at China-Africa relations, I think one of the most important things that if any other region in the world can draw inspiration from, it's the model, the FOCAC model, so that Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. I think if you look at FOCAC and how it has evolved since its founding about 20 years ago, there's been very strong commitment to certain principles which underpins that relationship, right? And we continue to see that with each passing FOCAC, there is an increasing openness to how Africa wants to pursue its development. When we saw the increase in development finance and investment in the mid-2010s, for instance, 2016 was a particularly important year for Chinese capital into African countries. We saw it spread across several sectors. And one of the effects that has really done, for instance, I think I always like to use the smartphone company called Transsion. So Transsion is a major smartphone holding for smartphone brands in African countries. Perhaps half of the African mobile market is either using Techno, itel, and all of the sub-brands within that Transsion holding, which has created a lot of jobs. But not just a lot of jobs. What it did was to bring the first, manufacturing of such technology into the continent, and that was in Ethiopia, for instance, with local content, because a lot of some of the the products are coming out with the Ethiopian Amharic language, and even in payments as well, like in fintech. So one of the biggest financial or payment companies in Nigeria, for instance, which is Africa's biggest economy, is OPay, and OPay is heavily, backed by Chinese investment, and that has really opened up, payments into the unbanked population. So even though Nigeria is a big economy, over about 40% of adult citizens, don't have bank accounts, and many of them don't have way to access banks. So of course, with the mobile phones, they're able to engage in business. So of course, there is a lot of investment into the continent, and hopefully the FDI continues to grow. But I just want to wrap up by touching on one point which we talked about earlier, which is on debt and lending. I think even from if you look at 2020, for instance, there was so much attention in Nigeria regarding debt. I actually interviewed one of our parliamentarians because he went on record to talk about concerns about over Chinese debt. There was no clarity then, and it took a lot of that pressure came from a lot from Western media and how Nigeria is going to be debt trapped and all of that. That inspired our government to direct the debt management office to go look to the data, investigate what percentage of Nigeria's public debt is held by China. And when the figure came out, it was 4%. Think about that. So much media attention and all of the rhetoric and everything around it. And when the figure came out 4%, it immediately killed the vitriol that we're seeing. And I think it's very crucial when we're reading news and hearing about investments and credits, it's very crucial to focus on the fact. And as we say, in my school, Renmin University, or in Chinese, shishi kuishi, that means you have to separate the truth from the facts. Because if you do that, it would surprise you in many instances, how much what you have in reality on the ground does not hold up to the narratives. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Very, very good. Very good. Matt, can I bring you into this discussion about, we talked about the media and particularly the dominant Western media. So the media in the United States is extremely strong. You painted a picture that the view in the United States is extremely negative towards, some sort of collaborative relationship with China. What role do you feel that the media in the United States plays in that? Because clearly we in this part of the world too are subject, can I use that word, to the views of the mainstream Western media, be it CNN, NBC, BBC, etc. How critical and what is the media playing a role that is counterproductive within the sort of political, real politics in the United States about China and the rest of the world?
Well, I mean, the media is an extension of, what I was talking about, this kind of growing obsession with China. Is obviously also in the government dialogue, and it just picks up on that. So, if you look at U.S. media, and even the international financial media, I tend to read the Financial Times every day. I mean, the slant is very much against China. I think it has grown more so, and this is unfortunate with the Ukraine war, even though China really hasn't broken the sanctions and done any of that, but it seems to have slipped over, the emotional outrage at what Russia has done in invading Ukraine, that kind of slipped over into seeing China and Russia as the same thing, and that, Taiwan is going to be the extension of the Ukraine war. So I do think that the media tends to amplify, not correct or be a critical force. And
thank you, Matthew. Jomo, got a question for you as well. In Southeast Asia, it is very clear that the South China Sea issue is a very big one, and among some countries more so than others. Yet you talked about a non-alignment sort of a cohesion, a movement within the developing countries, and also a peace movement. Do you see a possibility of things in the South China Sea being resolved between ASEAN and China through the creation of some sort of determined effort towards a peace initiative? And who would start that? Who would initiate that, apart from you?
Well, thank you, Chandran, but I'm certainly in no position to begin any such dialogue. I'm not a diplomat or in such a position. But let me emphasize that being non-aligned doesn't mean being completely uncritical. Yeah. And I would say that as far as China is concerned, you can't talk about globalization and the rules of globalization and then not take seriously the law of the sea. And this is where I think there is a problem with China. I used to work for a Chinese Undersecretary General of the United Nations, and we often had a lot of disagreements. But what I appreciated about him was that we were always mutually very respectful. And this is something which, unfortunately, I find quite lacking in other circles. And so I think these questions can be resolved. He would be what somebody would call a hawk today in the Chinese context. But nonetheless, I was always impressed by his commitment to find solutions, especially peaceful solutions. So I would say that more generally speaking, China has a very important precedent, which was set by the late Zhou Enlai, the first Prime Minister of the People's Republic, which was enunciated at Bandung. And I would go by the Bandung principles, which are, of course, silent on some of these very specific maritime issues. And we would need to address that. But I think so there is a great deal of room for that. There is a problem with overfishing, for example, and there are Chinese boats. And I think this addresses one of the issues which we just heard addressed in the African context. I think we have to recognize that China is not a monolithic entity, that there are Chinese business interests and Chinese business interests, which are very different. So you may well have Chinese business interests, which are actually quite irresponsible, but we shouldn't hold all of China responsible for that. Just as you might find, business interests of another country quite irresponsible, and you don't hold the whole nation responsible for that. And this is something which is lacking. And that's why I think I appreciate Eric Solheim's clarification on the debt trap issue. The debt trap issue is actually, as he correctly points out, it's an instrument, it's a propaganda issue. And even an American magazine of some influence, The Atlantic, has had a very definitive article actually showing the nature of the debt relations involved in the case of Sri Lanka and how that happened. In fact, I would be much more critical of the Sri Lankan regime and how it went about handling many of these issues. But I think it is really completely opportunistic to use the Sri Lanka's problems to blame it on China. China accounts for about 10%, if I remember correctly, of total Chinese debt, and it is and they actually resolve some of these issues by providing a long lease agreement, which did not violate Sri Lanka's sovereignty, did not violate Sri Lanka's access to its military naval port, and so on and so forth. So I think we really need to address these issues. And I think that particularly on sustainability issues, we all have a lot to learn from each other, and we have a lot to learn from China. Take up, for example, in Southeast Asia, we have a big problem of seawater levels rising and affecting, for example, rice fields in Vietnam, and rice fields in Bangladesh. Now, and even I'm told now increasingly in Tamil Nadu, where Eric Solheim is. Now, in all these situations, the Chinese, after realizing that the rest of the world had ignored some very, very basic issues, actually promoted research on rice growing from about 15 years ago, and they have successfully experimented with growing rice. Now, we may have a lot to learn from the United States. Louisiana, for example, is relatively low. It is quite possible that the Louisiana rice fields have been affected by salt water as well. And so there is a great deal we can learn from each other. Finally, if I may take this opportunity to address Dr. Burrows, I think he made a fair criticism. I think that I have very little grounds for optimism, but it's precisely the pessimism of the analysis which forces me to be optimistic about what we must strive to do. Otherwise, I think we give up. And when we give up, I mean, as Ms. Xiong has reminded us, I mean, the 1.5 degree rise. I mean, the Economist magazine is openly campaigning for abandoning that 1.5 degrees. We have seen, how various arrangements. Nelson Mandela fought for the public health exception to TRIPS. How that was basically ignored in handling the pandemic recently. So we have a number of setbacks, but it doesn't mean that we give up. It's precisely because of that we have to keep trying, and it's precisely because of that I do hope that we will be able to shed some light and shed some hope in this rather bleak scenario which we face currently.
Yeah, and for the little I know of Dr. Burrows, Matthew, he's very optimistic too. That's why he said, before I mean, we got so many people want to say things, but I know Yutong had a hand up. And the last word to you, Matthew, on an optimistic note. So Yutong, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Chandran. So I just want to make some actual points about what I said about ecological civilization. Actually, we never want to export, so-called export some models. And I don't think we should encourage export of any system, methodology, ideological thinking, any model. I think we just want to act as some kind of a person who awake first to alert people with that idea that we need to think about a bit more, a bit far. And so during the just concluded China-Arab Summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping summarized the Chinese-Arabic cooperation as help each other, equity, mutual benefit, tolerance, and mutual learning. That's the key. And I cannot agree more with Mr. Eric Solheim's view that we should focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. And we should respect each other's way of living and thinking. And also, but on the issue of carbon equity, carbon justice, that's also what we need to exercise respect and acknowledging the historical inequity and the status in the development. One example is that in China, we never use electricity to dry up laundries, while in the United States and in many Western countries, it's a very common practice. So what I'm going to say is that ecological civilization is not ideological, it's nothing political, but it involves it's a change of a lifestyle, change of a way of thinking. It's about sustainable fashion industry, about responsible tourism, about eating good food, about changing our lifestyle, the way of thinking. That's the important. That's nothing about political or ideological aspects. Yeah.
Thank you. Very important clarification. We're just on 4 I got 2 minutes to give the last word to Matthew. He's earned it for staying up to 3 a.m. And as you respond to that, Matthew, there's a question. What do you believe are the root causes of the anti-China sentiment in the USA? So you got about 2 minutes, and then I've got to end this wonderful session, which could go on for 3 hours. Over to you.
The root causes, I would say, is one thing, domestic. We talked a little bit about this on the globalization undercut, anyways, the impression it undercut middle class standard of living in the US and other Western countries. And so when you feel hurt, you want to point to others to blame. And obviously Mexico came in for a lot of blame, China as well. So it's in the popular mind, it was rooted in that, that Trump amplified that China took away all the jobs in the industrial sector from the US. And then this, as I mentioned before, this framework of democracy versus authoritarianism. Again, democracy's feeling a little bit embattled, and obviously the democracy itself in the US is under attack. So all of those issues, I think, fed into this hostility towards China.
Thank you. I've got to end now. I feel like I've completely done a disservice to all of you on the panel by not having enough time to dig deeper into the kind of profound nuanced things you made. But I think you all seasoned enough to know that on panels, we just have limited amount of time. We all try and stay disciplined and say what we want. I hope you all felt you enjoyed learning from each other. I think the underlying thing I got from this was we should all learn from each other. There's a lot to be shared, that we should essentially embrace what unites us rather than what divides us. And so let me firstly, Eric, thank you so much for joining as the keynote and then joining the panel. And each of the panel members, a million thanks. I think there's a lot of questions. I hope we've started a discussion that enables us to bring diverse audiences together and without any sort of second guessing, say what we all think. So appreciate your indulgence. To the audience, please stay on for the next panel. We've got a great keynote speaker from China and then a great panel as well, discussing the theme of essentially the existential threats and how we deal with them on a practical level.